Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. My name is Megan Spencer and I'm a Research and Communications Assistant for the Polis Water Sustainability Project, which is based at the University of Victoria. Our Communications Director, Laura Brandis, is typically in my spot as host of our webinar series, but Laura is currently on maternity leave until next August, so I'll be hosting our webinars this season in her absence. And today's webinar, Evolution in Transboundary Watershed Governance, Lessons from the Mackenzie Basin, is the first webinar in our 2015-2016 Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, which marks the beginning of our 6th season. And our next session will explore the need for legal protection of environmental flows and will take place in October. And we'll be circulating the details of that session in the next few weeks, so stay tuned for details on that. I want to thank you all for being here. I know some of you have attended our webinars in the past, but for those of you who haven't, I wanted to give you some insight into the Creating a Blue Dialogue series. So its goal is to bring together water leaders and practitioners in one virtual space and to engage with emerging and priority issues in water policy and water governance. And in this webinar, as I hope you're all aware, our two guest speakers will share the story behind the development and negotiation of the Mackenzie River Basin Bilateral Water Management Agreement, and they will also discuss why similar transboundary agreements are critical to the success of governance of watersheds in Canada. This webinar is also intended to build on Polis's January 2014 publication, A Blueprint for Watershed Governance in British Columbia, which focused on 9 winning conditions needed to move towards more sophisticated watershed governance in Canada. So we couldn't carry out the series without the support of our various partners. All of them are listed here on this slide. I want to say a big thank you to all of them and for their core support in this series, as well as to highlight the support of Water Canada magazine, who is our media sponsor. So before I hand things over to the speakers, there's a few housekeeping items I'd like to run through with you, and the first has to do with audio. So as I'm sure you've all realized, I have a blanket mute on everyone. Since we're expecting so many listeners, this means they won't have any audio feedback chaos to distract us from the presentations, which might raise the question, well, how do we deal with questions? And I see that many of you are using the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. So after Minister Miltenberger and Merrell-Ann are finished presenting, that's where we'll handle the questions. I'll serve as the moderator and read them out as they come in, and the speakers will be able to answer them. And the final housekeeping item I'd like to share with you is that now is a nice opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat box and to perhaps give a weather update from your region. Just nice to get a sense of the community in the room since we're all scattered across the country. It's nice to know who is in this virtual space. So if you could say who you are, what organization you're with, and how many folks are listening with you, that should help us feel more like a community. And I'd like to introduce today's speakers, who will be co-presenting their story from the Government of Northwest Territories offices in Yellowknife. Very grateful that they were able to make time in their busy schedules to speak with us today. So today we're joined by the Honorable J. Michael Miltenberger, who is responsible for a number of ministries in the Government of Northwest Territories, including the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Under his leadership, the GNWT introduced its Water Stewardship Strategy, Northern Waters, Northern Voices, setting a very high bar in Canada for comprehensive and innovative governmental policy foundations in water. He led the Northwest Territories' successful efforts to secure its Mackenzie River Basin Transboundary Water Agreement with Alberta, which was signed on March 18th of this year. Minister Miltenberger is also leading Government of Northwest Territories in undertaking a complete reform of its Water Act, and will do so by employing a collaborative legislative development process. And Merrell-Ann Phare is also joining us as a speaker. Merrell-Ann is a lawyer, writer, and the founding executive director of the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources, a national First Nations environmental organization. Merrell-Ann is chief negotiator on behalf of the Government of Northwest Territories in their negotiation of transboundary water agreements in the Mackenzie River Basin. and she is a member of the Forum for Leadership on Water, and she has promoted the need for a national water strategy. She's also legal counsel and advisor to a number of First Nation and other government and organizations, and regularly speaks on water issues and First Nations. So, with that introduction to our webinar and to the speakers, it's my pleasure to hand things over to Minister Merrell-Ann. So, go ahead.
Good morning, Miltenberger.
Hello, this is Merrell-Ann Phare. Can everybody hear us?
I hear you fine.
Okay, good. Excellent.
Great.
Okay, I will just advance to the... So we're here to talk to you today about the process and the outcomes that we experienced, that we went through in negotiating the Transboundary water agreement that we have with Alberta. We're going to talk to you about 5 different stories that comprise the negotiation. So this won't just be about the agreement. Only the first story will really be about the agreement, and we're going to touch on that in a high-level way. We also want to, though, share with you, because we think many of you would probably be interested in the applicability of this agreement in other jurisdictions, how we got to the agreement. And so the existence of complexity as a feature in negotiating these kinds of agreements, the types and the role of time and the influence of time, the negotiation process itself and how we structured our team and some of the influences in negotiating this agreement. And then also we'll end with the last final story on why this should matter to Canada. So hopefully we are hoping that whether you're inside or outside of government or a negotiator or a process person, or you're more interested in law and policy, that there will be something useful for you in this presentation in at least one of the stories.
So this agreement was a very, very major agreement for the people of the Northwest Territories. And when we negotiated, we had a plan to come to the Northwest Territories and have it signed in Yellowknife with all the Aboriginal governments in a huge celebration. However, as we were working towards that, the government of Alberta decided to call an election. And then we had 2 choices: to sign before the election or wait till the election was over and hopefully get back on their list to get it signed after the election. And we made the decision that we wanted to get it signed while we had a chance with the government that was in power, just in case. So on March 18th, 2015, we went to Edmonton and we signed the agreement, and the picture here shows the premiers of Alberta and the Northwest Territories, myself and Minister Fawcett. Politics being the dynamic and often unforgiving profession. Shortly after, at the election day, polling day, it was clear that people of Alberta had made a significant change in direction. So to us, we were relieved that, in fact, we had signed this agreement with the government of the day, because the incoming government is faced with enormous challenges, and we were concerned with the time we had left in our government, which is now 68 days, that we would not have managed to get back on their list to get this agreement signed. So that's a bit of the context for that picture and the actual signing of the agreement.
So for those of you who are not intimately familiar with the Mackenzie River Basin, it is 20% of the land mass of Canada. The light yellow on the slide shows you the extent of the basin. It's very large, 1.8 million kilometers, the 10th largest in the world. It has 3 deltas, and 11% of the fresh water that flows into the Arctic Ocean flows from the Mackenzie River Basin. So it has a massive effect on global weather patterns and on Arctic circulation. And 80% of the waters that come into the Northwest Territories come from Alberta. This is the actual agreement. You can get it online. In terms of what we will go over today in our first story on the actual pieces of the agreement itself, we're only going to talk about it at the highlight level. You really need to look at it yourself. There's 15 sections to the agreement, 10 appendices. It's a total of over 100 pages long. So it's quite a comprehensive agreement, but we'll touch on over the next 6 or 8 slides the key elements of the agreement. So first off, we find amazing about this agreement is that it's actually not just a water agreement, even though it's called a Transboundary Water Agreement. It is an aquatic ecosystem protection agreement. We have, for example, worked with Alberta to decide that the aquatic ecosystem needs come first, that this is about maintaining the ecological integrity of the aquatic ecosystem. That goal was given to us in the Mackenzie River Basin Master Agreement. And so our task was to figure out how can we do that in this specific context. And so in all of the various pieces of the agreement, it's about trying to determine how do we meet aquatic ecosystem needs first, and then how do we maintain ecological health. Of course, there are very many pieces to the aquatic ecosystem, and we're not, part of our task as two governments will be to figure out over time how to even do this, how to measure these things, but the commitment is there to look at a broad suite of indicators and to determine ecological health that way. In terms of key pieces of the agreement, because of course it does also look at water quality and quantity and all the standard elements in a water agreement, I will at the high level say that what we are trying to do on water quality is we've committed to setting site-specific water quality objectives where needed, when according to a classification system, that we look at all of the rivers that cross over from Alberta into the Northwest Territories, determine their classification, and then depending on the assessment of the classification, the higher classification rivers, so those would be the ones that have greater use, traditional use, greater development pressure, would get site-specific, so that would mean water quality objectives that are relevant to the type and nature of northern rivers, because northern rivers are quite different than southern rivers. So that was a very significant agreement that we will work a long time to determine how to actually set those objectives where they are necessary. But we're really trying to maintain natural variability, so to not deviate much from the current state of affairs, and that is what is seen as the way to achieve ecological integrity, to maintain ecological integrity. We have ways that we will be doing that, triggers, what we're calling triggers, which will allow us to engage in management actions before we get to any point of violating any of the objectives, and that's hugely dependent on us maintaining cooperation between our jurisdictions, and this is a cooperation agreement, so we're very confident on that. The other piece is that what we're referring to as nasties on the slide, which are the toxic, bioaccumulative, persistent, man-made chemicals, we have committed to eliminating them to below the level of detection. So we're in the process of trying to determine what that means and how to do that. In terms of water quantity, we have, again, the principle of putting ecosystem needs first, have agreed that the basic approach is to meet ecological flows of the rivers as the water bodies as they at the border, and so the way you do that, of course, is through scientific and traditional knowledge assessment of what rivers need, water bodies need, so the general scientific consensus worldwide, although we will continue to look at this to determine what this is, would be somewhere in the realm of 85 to 90% is what the ecosystem needs, and then we would split the rest. So if we leave 90% of the water in the river, then Alberta would be able to remove 5%, and we would be able to, and then 5% extra would pass through to our borders, so a total of 95%. But the significance is that, of course, we're meeting ecological needs first. We have a special case with one of the rivers because of its use, and that is the Slave River, where we have determined ahead of time a threshold. So this is something that we've determined now as 1.9% of the average annual flow. This can be revisited obviously over time and is way more than Alberta will ever likely use in their estimation, but it's meant to be very protective of the ecosystem and just to articulate what we each see as a minimum at this point. The other piece on water quantity is that we have agreed that interbasin transfers will not be allowed outside of the basin except by special act of legislature. The Northwest Territories has a policy prohibiting interbasin transfer, and Alberta has a law that allows it, but only by special act of legislature. So we agreed that that would be the case here also. Now this is a cooperation agreement, significant between the two governments, and that is the fundamental, its fundamental strength. So we have agreed that we take a risk-informed management approach. So when I mentioned earlier that we will be classifying rivers, that is one of the key pieces of that risk-informed management approach, to look at the risk facing a water body and to govern our management, our collaborative management accordingly. The traditional knowledge and Aboriginal government and Aboriginal knowledge involvement, local knowledge, is critical to this, and there are many places through the agreement you will see where traditional knowledge is referenced in how we will manage the waters. And also we have a significant section, Section 5, called the Notification, Information Sharing and Consultation section, where we agree to work together and notify each other of any developments or activities that may impact the ecological integrity of the other jurisdiction. So that's before those developments or activities go ahead. We talk to the other jurisdiction and share information about those developments or activities and consult with those jurisdictions and attempt to deal with their concerns. It's important to know that the developments and activities that we're talking about are not just specific on-the-ground projects, but also changes to laws and policies and programs. So it's a wide-ranging commitment to cooperate between the governments to share and collaborate to ensure that we don't impact the ecological integrity of the other jurisdiction. Many people have asked about what happens if we don't agree, and what we also have is a dispute resolution section. If anybody who's on the webinar can identify this slide, and I'll give you a hint, it's from a movie. We will, I don't know, we'll send out a prize or something. But this is, if we don't see eye to eye as two jurisdictions, and we have to take into account that we might not, we have a conflict resolution provision that says, of course, each government can litigate if we want to. No rights to litigate have been eliminated, but we will work through consensus through what is called the Bilateral Management Committee. So that's a committee that will charge with implementing the agreement between the two jurisdictions. And if that committee can't resolve it, then it'll work its way up through the systems and to a political level, a diplomatic level of resolution, hopefully. Of course, if that doesn't work, then there are all other remaining options are still there. But we are trying very much to have this be a conciliatory approach where we work cooperatively to achieve the goals of the agreement.
As we look at the issue of complexity, this process would demonstrate that this was very complex. We all had our own jurisdiction, our own bureaucracies, our own systems to deal with on the political side, legal side, policy side, dealing with the science. We in the Northwest Territories had 42,000 very interested and paying close attention Northerners. We had 7 major Aboriginal governments. We have 3 provinces, 2 territories, and on our side we had the federal government in the Northwest Territories, just in the process of negotiating the final transfer through devolution of the rights over, control over land, water, and resource development. So we'll touch on a few of those areas, but just the dynamics of all the players and those interconnected systems, plus the major systems in each jurisdiction, was one that posed some challenges in terms of navigation to a successful conclusion, but one that was done. So we have a picture here that pretty clear to see. I would assume everybody would agree that Arnold is the Alberta, and I'm poor little Danny DeVito in the Northwest Territories, but it's not quite as it seems. There are clearly some major differences. They're 10 times the size in terms of population, but we're almost double the size in physical size, in geographic area. They have a GDP of 338 billion. Ours is a mere 4.4 billion. Yet on an average total income, we have a somewhat higher total income. They are a mature province. They're very, very wealthy. They have 2 NHL teams, and we have rec hockey, no football. And by almost every measure, they are bigger than us, but not in all the same ways. And while we are seen as remote, small, mostly Aboriginal population with 1 MP, we knew we had to be ready when we came to the table with Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. And so if we weren't ready, then we could lose out because we weren't ready. And what we have in terms of the politics, we have a line on the map, the 60th parallel, just a pencil-thin line, but it's an amazingly and immensely important political boundary. Up till the recent election, I think for 50 years, Alberta basically had the same type of government. In the Northwest Territories, we have consensus style, no parties. We have a population 50% Aboriginal, very rural and land-based. We have some experience at high levels cooperating with Alberta. We have an MOU in terms of how we interact on a sort of high-level basis, but this negotiation was one of the first. And we had to move carefully on both sides. There was great concern that the negotiations recognize and respect the decision-making authorities within the provinces and territories, that our intent was not to meddle in their affairs. We, in our case, we had a mandatory relationship with the federal government that we were trying to negotiate our way out of as we were negotiating with Alberta. Alberta was very clear that they saw the issue of no interference in their internal affairs as a major issue, and one that we did not argue with clearly because we had the same concerns, but it was a very key issue of priority. So when we look at our 2 territories, there's the political differences and there's the approach to resource development. Alberta has a very aggressive resource development agenda, and they are moving to explore and develop as much of the resources as possible. In the Northwest Territories, we are much more deliberate. We are very, very concerned about scale and pace. While we are doing resource development, we're looking for oil and gas. We have the biggest diamond mines in the country up in the Northwest Territories. We are looking very carefully at how do we maintain that balance between the resource development and the protection of the environment. So all these combined to create a situation that required a lot of patience and skill on the parties on both sides, and as well as BC and Saskatchewan. I mean, we ended up with a lot of cases of multi-party discussion. So it was a big issue, but we managed, because we're at the table on an interest-based basis, to negotiate a successful agreement. So I've referenced now a couple times the Devolution Agreement. It's a thing that probably, well, in the provinces, people wouldn't even know because they have control and authority over all their own affairs. In the Northwest Territories, the federal government had slowly been devolving authority to us, starting with forestry and education and health and highways, but the big ones they'd hung on to, and we finally negotiated a deal and we signed that deal for devolution on April 1st, 2014, which gave us final control, or for the most part, control of land, water, and resource development. And this picture is important because it shows in the very front Minister Valcourt on the left, Minister McLeod on the right, and behind us, I'm in the picture, but behind us is our representatives from all the Aboriginal governments that had signed on for devolution, the Gwich'in, the Inuvialuit, the Klincho, the Métis, were all there at the table and came up for the signing. So it was a very big issue, and what this shows as well, and I touched on this a bit and I'll touch on it a little bit further, that we had, before devolution, the federal government, ANSI, had responsibility for water, and so they were part of our negotiating team, but at the same time they were negotiating at a different table with us on opposite sides of the table, the transfer of those authorities, and it caused, in many cases, considerable tension and friction as we move forward because of that conflicting situation, in our opinion. Once again, we managed to we worked through it, but as we were dealing with Alberta and looking forward, we had to be very careful and cautious about what was happening on our flanks and in our rear with these other activities going on tied to devolution. However, we did get it done.
Okay, one of the other complicating factors, the complexity factors, was the existence of Indigenous rights, obviously all through the Northwest Territories. We have, on the slide, you can see the pale green area is the South Slave area, and that is the area that has unsettled land claims right now. There's Treaty 8 and Treaty 11 there, but you have the 3 Aboriginal governments that have asserted rights, and the Decho Métis and the Quechua, and all other governments, even downstream of them, have the right to be involved, obviously, in consultations and negotiations here through their land claim agreements. So we had a series of trying to determine how can we bring all of these people in, respect the relationships we have already with Aboriginal governments as a result of devolution and as a result of land claims, but create a manageable process. Similarly, the land claims agreements and the commitments that we feel would be in future land claim agreements, even if they are not yet negotiated, is that they include a clause that says that the water shall remain, that waters that pass by or flow into the land claim land will remain substantially unaltered as to quality, quantity, and rate of flow. And so this is one of the situations where we took from the land claims a source of strength in our negotiations with Alberta. These terms don't bind Alberta. Obviously, they're not signatories to our land claims agreements, but they are standards that we felt that we had to meet. And so that was a key interest we brought to the table with the Aboriginal governments supporting us in doing that. The other key piece is that, in terms of complexity, is that we are ultimately a downstream jurisdiction. You can see the water begins, in most cases here in northern British Columbia, moves through Alberta and then flows north into the Beaufort through the Mackenzie. And so when you're the downstream government, you tend to get the result of either the good or bad decisions of upstream jurisdictions. And so we needed to push as hard as we could to ensure that, in our view, we were lifting everybody up in the upstream jurisdictions to something that could protect us, rather than being left with what was kind of left over from previous decisions.
So as we look at the issue of water, it's always been, in my mind, having been environment minister for 9 years now, that there is a need to link. There is a link. There's no need to link it. There is a link between energy and water. It's not done clearly in Canada. I mean, I've been to many FPT meetings, federal, provincial, territorial meetings, the Council of Federation. The federal government doesn't meet with the premiers, but that issue is one that needs to be addressed. And for us, it is clearly a major subtext. Alberta is a major resource producing jurisdiction, and most of their requirements tied to energy are also tied to water. We have hydro issues. We have all those relations, the relationship to the oil and gas sector. that it's impossible in our mind to separate the two. And as we were negotiating this, it was a subtext that was, for us, always there in our mind. And we know that we're impacted in British Columbia, for example. They got the Bennett Dam, they're moving ahead with Site C. We're impacted by all the development in northern Alberta, mainly tied to the oil sands, not to mention their significant agricultural industry. So all those are challenges, and it's an issue that's not been resolved. We're still moving forward as a country, trying to look at those issues separately. But if you talk about aquatic ecosystems and integrated ecosystem management, you can't do one without the other. So that's an unmet challenge that we have ahead of us. So we had challenges aplenty before us. It looked daunting. People were, in many quarters, did not think we had a hope of being able to sit at a table with Alberta and come up with a meaningful agreement. But you have to be optimistic. I'm a golfer as well. I'm by nature optimistic, no matter how badly I play. And so for us on this one, this was a goal that we knew we could do, that it was daunting, but if we applied ourselves and work hard and we stay at the table in a good faith basis with Alberta as they did with us, that we would get it done. So that's the complexity story.
So the third story is the issue and the role of time. The negotiations often succeed or fail on time pressure or the lack of time pressure. And both of those pieces came into play here. There's always key moments where decisions have to be made. And so we want to explain to you some of the influences of time as we went through this.
So there's two types of time in this instance that I'd just like to touch on. There is the bureaucratic time, where the bureaucracy tends to operate in years, sometimes decades, and they move differently and they see things differently. They have a different life context that they view their business. Politicians, on the other hand, like myself, when I get elected, I have 1,460 days to affect change. And we're always on the clock. I have an app on my phone and on my iPad that tells me to the second how much time we have left to the next election, which in this case today is 68 days. So we run into the two different concepts of time as we try to move forward. That's one of the complexity issues as well, of pushing a system that's not designed to be nimble and very, very quick or responsive to try to respond to what could be one political lifetime of 1,460 days. So the pressure is constantly on. We're at the table with other jurisdictions at the same time trying to manage our own bureaucracy and system to keep it moving. This also affects how policy gets developed, and that as well takes time. And we have come up with ways to push the system, to compress time, and as we've done this, we've been basically sorting some of this out on the fly. And as we dealt with those issues at times, so too does Alberta, so too does Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and the federal government. And we're trying to coordinate those respective clocks. And those clocks can be dramatically impacted, for example, like especially the political clock can be dramatically impacted when you have an election, like happened in Alberta back in April, where those clocks had to hit a reset button that's never been hit before. So it is a major challenge.
So like all stories, the final agreement we have with Alberta, the story of it actually started a very long time ago. And so I'll try to stay brief, but go through the timeline. Things really started to move in Canada largely as a result of Environment Canada's role in the Rio Summit in 1992. In 1997, you have the Mackenzie River Basin Master Agreement being signed. And that's the agreement that set out the big principles that would apply in the basin and the need to create these bilateral agreements in general. So you really need to go back to that agreement. And our current Premier, Bob McLeod, was involved in the negotiation of that master agreement way back when. We had an agreement that we signed with Yukon right away after that, but then nothing else really happened for quite some time in terms of actual signings. around 2006, 2008, in our jurisdiction, there were quite a few water gatherings that were starting to pick up speed, 2006 to 2008, in particular Keepers of the Water and others. And in 2007, we signed an MOU with Alberta that set out what the process would be for doing these negotiations. Then, just around that time, an event happened for the minister that he will explain what that noose means.
So every political jurisdiction that we've been chatting about a bit here today, using Alberta as an example, shows that political systems are from time to time subject to political upheaval and unanticipated events. We're no different in the Northwest Territories, and I got caught up in a political upheaval that saw me for a brief period of time not being on cabinet. And when that happened, a bit of a traumatic event. However, it quickly became apparent to me that there was some significant opportunities here. So what happened in that intervening period, one of the biggest things that happened was shortly after the event, I was able as an MLA to work the halls of our legislature, and we passed a motion unanimously in the legislature that saw and was voted on that we saw that water is a basic human right and access to water. And that triggered the fundamental legislative support for us, initiative to move forward, the momentum to move forward, to start pursuing the whole cycle and path that we're on. And it happened for a number of reasons, that there was increasing concern in our territory about what was happening with water, but also we're a consensus-based government, and that upheaval that we'd gone through caused a lot of folks to have second thoughts and be more receptive to some of the things like this that I brought forward. In addition to that, I took that opportunity as I did my work as MLA to start reading even more than I normally do, and to mull things over. And one of the books that I came across was the Water, Weather, and Mountain West, which I picked up in an airport and I read, and it resonated with me because it was just south of us, didn't reach into the Northwest Territories, but it was done by a guy that lived in Camrose, Bob Sanford. I got the book, I read it, I kept it, and then as I added it to my mulling and my thinking, and then the election occurred, and I got reelected, and I was back in cabinet and back in business. And it was clear that as a government we had to get our thinking clearer, that we had started moving on water and what we need to do, but we weren't. Our thinking was nowhere near ready for us to engage in transboundary negotiations, let alone talk to the people of the Northwest Territories. Plus, at the same time, we were getting ready for devolution, and we had to show the people of the Northwest Territories that we were ready, that we could handle big, complex issues like water. We had learned how to deal with writing laws with Aboriginal governments like the Wildlife Act and the Species at Risk Act, but the big, really touchy issue of how do we deal with water had yet to be addressed. So we worked together with the Aboriginal governments, taking the same approach we had developed with writing legislation, and we started a 4-year process to get us to that. And what happened when I got reelected, I picked up the phone and I called Bob Sanford, and I talked to him, and his thinking had been focused on the West, and I talked to him about our challenges up in the Northwest Territories, and he was very interested. We brought him up, and that started a relationship that is critical to us moving forward. At the same time up here, there was a gentleman by the name of David Livingston that still worked for the federal government that had been pushing for a bigger, better approach to water as well. But Bob Sanford, in my mind, for me as the minister, was the critical door opener, the linchpin that got us tied into the Rosenberg Foundation, to all the water resources down south. And he was very, very instrumental in working with us as we spent 4 years developing our water strategy, and we could not have done it without him. And he's been a strong supporter throughout that process, and as we've moved into Transboundary, he has stayed engaged and helpful all along the way. Then, as we move forward, we finished the water strategy in 2010. We came out a year later with the action plan, and then shortly thereafter, we had the very good fortune of hiring Dr. Erin Kelly to work for us in Environment Natural Resources. And she has been, once again, she's one of the top water people in my mind in the country. She worked under Dr. Schindler, got her doctorate under Dr. Schindler, and in fact, she's done such an amazing job for us over the last few years. She's now Assistant Deputy Minister, Dr. Kelly.
And so the water strategy was critical for many things, as the minister pointed out, but in terms of the negotiations, it did two key things. It set a very high-level goal that waters of the NWT remain clean, abundant, and productive for all time. So we looked at that as that's the target we had to meet as a negotiating team. And then, of course, there's some explanations in there about aquatic ecosystems are healthy and people work together and collaborate, and also that the land claims commitments are affirmed again in the water strategy.
So after the water strategy was done, it became the basis for our plan to move forward with transboundary negotiations, and we initially started that work with initial contact with Alberta, and we were doing it the normal way, which is we had our staff contacting the staff in Alberta. And I was given my concerns about time and pressures and needing really qualified people that were actually water people and not having a lot of those at the time. I had the good fortune of being on a trip to Ottawa where I was down to do some chatting with a water group, and I met the author of Denying the Source, which of course is Merrell-Ann Phare. I read her book a couple times. I met her a couple times, and it was clear to me that given her background and skill, both as a lawyer and as an expert negotiator and knowledge of water, that she would be a critical asset. And that led to her becoming on board as we will get to very soon, our chief negotiator.
So the fourth storyline we want to share with you is about the negotiations themselves. There were many, under the master agreement, there are a number of agreements that actually need to be negotiated. The one we're talking about today is obviously the NWT-Alberta border watershed area, but there's another one that we will be negotiating. We are in negotiations right now. In fact, later today, we may have our final call to wrap up the negotiations on our BC agreement. We're very hopeful that that will happen today. We also have an agreement that we'll be negotiating with Saskatchewan. We're in the process of that. And then, as I said, we have the Yukon agreement, but we want to update that. So, and the minister has a broader vision, which is actually to apply the principles of the basin agreements to our most eastern border with Nunavut. So, I apologize for the typo on the slide there. It should say NWT Nunavut there. The negotiations, so all of those that's our long-term plan in terms of all of our agreements, and they're proceeding basically simultaneously. Our timeline is that we got going, we got our cabinet direction in February 2012. So we basically were in negotiations with Alberta for 3 years, late September to 2011 to 2014. We had to work with cabinet first and get direction, and then we proceeded. After that, we simultaneously, for reasons I'll explain later, commenced negotiations with BC, which we continue on with, as I said, and we had our signing ceremony with Alberta on March 18th. And for the rest of this year and probably into the next life of the government, we will continue on with our other agreements. Now, of course, part of our task was to build the best team, and we had to think of team very broadly in this context. There's a very linear kind of org chart way to look at it, where you have a person and another one, and the reporting lines are very clear and linear, and those folks, you know, in the best world, talk to each other in very nice, neat, predictable ways, which everybody knows doesn't actually happen. What really happens is this, where everybody talks to everybody, and you try and you have so many interests at play that you have to figure out how to organize and coordinate these things in a way that maximizes the leverage between the systems, not shuts it down. It wasn't simple. And we took our inspiration. I think this is just such a beautiful image. It's the very first org chart ever made in North America. It's by, in 1855, by a New York railway superintendent, David McCallum, and very organic, very moving, very many elements, very many overlaps, but it represents complexity, which is, I think, something we need to recognize, that there are very many moving parts in a negotiation like this. And so when we looked at our system, we realized we needed an internal team that had negotiations experience, science experience, engineering, Aboriginal liaison. We needed a political and a strategic link, which we will explain, that involved the minister, our premier, the whole of cabinet of NWT, and the principal secretary. And we also had to make external linkages. So we had representatives, we had connections to the Aboriginal Steering Committee, for example, and the expert advisors and NGOs and funders. And so this slide actually shows you all the people that were actually specifically involved in the negotiations, in the closest rung of negotiations. And you can see, in addition to the ones I've listed, we also had a stunningly talented facilitator, Lee Failing from Compass. And so all of us, we all worked together at various stages of the negotiation to try to make this happen over the 4 years.
So I just want to make a comment about the internal political team that we had here. We went to cabinet with our plan, and we got a strong mandate from the cabinet to proceed. Strong support from the principal secretary, who just coincidentally used to be the deputy minister of Environment and Natural Resources. So, and as minister, I was involved on the file literally on a daily, sometimes hourly basis as negotiations were happening, and responding back and forth. And the other big piece was the premier had a very, very close interest in this, and whenever he was asked to talk to his counterparts in Alberta or British Columbia or Yukon or Saskatchewan or the federal government, he would do that on his many meetings with them, and it all helped to give us a lot of political cover, over cover, top cover, but momentum and knowledge that we were proceeding right through with support from the highest levels right down to the negotiating table. So when we're getting ourselves organized, and when I talked earlier about bringing Merrell-Ann into the file, convincing her that we could use her skills and this would be a really interesting challenge for her. The concept I had in mind was we needed a team that was like a spear, and there was could only be one point on that spear that was going to lead the team at the negotiating table, and she would be flanked by very, very skilled people like Dr. Kelly and Shannon Cummings, one of our ADMs, and other folks, and that politically we would be behind her. I would be behind her as minister all day, every day if I needed to be, with cabinet at my back. And with that approach, we developed what I think is one of the best for a jurisdiction our size, dealing with big, powerful other jurisdictions. We've created and have some of the best people in the country working for us, using that kind of approach that has been, in my mind, one of the reasons we're here today having this discussion about what we managed to achieve.
And one of the reasons that I thought this was a really amazing file as a negotiator is just that it's unusual to have a close connection to the political apparatus, and I think sometimes the other jurisdictions found it quite disconcerting. But it was critical here because we needed timely direction. We were under a timeline. we needed strategic insight. The significance of the file in the Northwest Territories meant that we couldn't go too far without very clear and immediate responses from Cabinet. We needed a corporate knowledge, because you can see some of the players involved in the political realm have been on the file for a very long time, and even the Premier helped us with understanding the significance of the Master Agreement and some of the thinking behind it. We also needed to know how much risk we could take in this process, because they're very political issues when you're talking about water, and particularly if water agreements are going to in any way limit energy development or things like that, and you have elections in the middle. So we needed to really understand whether the system, to be frank, whether the system would have our back, was, as we were pushing some pretty controversial concepts and reaching agreement on them. And we needed also to pull levers pretty quickly. If things were going sideways or getting difficult, we needed to be able to communicate through our system and across systems as quickly as possible. And the word Becca is a Clicho word meaning point of the spear, and that's the word that the minister came up with the analogy of my role and the role of the team behind me. So when you think of an arrowhead, though, the spear, there's really three parts to it. If you think of that image, you've got the point of the spear, true enough, and we had a very unusual spearhead, arrowhead on our spear was me, who's the point of the spear, a lawyer. But then you had Michael, who's a politician, and we speak different languages, often in totally different quantity of words. And then we also had Aaron, a scientist, who taught us both a lot about science and water. I thought I knew water before I got on this file, but she's taught me a lot. And so the three of us worked together to really become this spear-like concept of launching the interests of the NWT in these negotiations. In terms of the negotiation stream, so this is some more of the complexity piece. We had simultaneous processes, multilateral processes, federal involvement, and then Aboriginal consultation that we had to deal with simultaneously. As I said, I've shown you all of the agreements that we want to do, but you can see that there are other jurisdictions also have agreements that they are developing. So every one of these circles represents at least one of the agreements. And so there's a lot of simultaneous discussions going on, because we don't want the agreements to compete with one another or to set standards that end up not being able to be fulfilled, or to have a drive down to the lowest common denominator. We're actually trying to have all the agreements be at the highest common denominator if we can. The simultaneous nature of the negotiations was that we were actually trying to start with three negotiations at once. We were trying to negotiate Alberta as the central focus. So each of the three agreements that Alberta had to sign were the ones that all of the jurisdictions agreed to start with. So BC, Alberta, NWT-Alberta, Saskatchewan, Alberta. And as we proceeded, one would get out ahead of the other sometimes. You would share information, trying to reach consensus, but then one organization might move ahead, one government would move ahead, and so the agreement would wait or stall out a little bit. And we also just had all of those political slippage pieces that happened, where Redford was out of office, and then Prentice, and the Chilcotin decision happened in BC during this time. We had oil prices starting to go down. We had restructuring of the Alberta Energy Regulator, which really was an internal reorganization within Alberta that moved a lot of their water people off the file. And so in the face of all of these things, we needed pretty constant political pressure to keep things moving. It was never sure whether we would finish all of those three agreements at the same time, but we certainly had the desire to. I think all jurisdictions did. But also what happened is that if you imagine that those three negotiations, Alberta is the meat in the sandwich, actually, if you conceive of it that way, where they had an upstream role vis-a-vis us, and they had a downstream role vis-a-vis British Columbia. And so they were very concerned about making sure that those two agreements were achievable by them. And so we ended up having to stop our negotiations with Alberta for a time period and commence in earnest negotiations with BC, so that some of the key clauses that were of concern to Alberta we could reach agreement with BC so that all three of us were on the same page. And so that's just the nature of how one can pop up and the other one you're waiting and going back and forth to try not to feel outnumbered, to try to maintain trust, but to try to actually deal with the issues each jurisdiction has. And then, of course, we had the federal and territorial role.
So when you look at this picture, of course, the one in white would be the Northwest Territories, is the way I tell the story. They were involved with us as we did the water strategy, and we had their support. Chuck Strahl was the minister of the day, and he signed the agreement, which got this whole process started, the broad water strategy. And there was serendipity in there, because there was if one of his staff was away on a month-long holiday and another staff came in, and the strategy made it to the minister's desk that might have otherwise been diverted and got signed. And that was the huge stepping stone for us. But then we had, as I touched on earlier, this dual role with the federal government, where they were still responsible for water as we negotiated devolution. But at the same time, they were sitting across the table from us, negotiating the Devolution Agreement and the transfer of water, and it caused some very tough internal negotiations, lots of aggravation and frustration, and it was right to the end before it was finally sorted out, and it was a difficult situation. It was a tough relationship till it was over, and we finally got the deal signed. There were things we would like to get done differently, but we have to live with it. But it was that dual role with the federal government was a very significant complicating factor, causing us, as I said earlier, to spend a lot of time watching our flanks and rear to find out what might be happening at the negotiating table that we didn't know about when we were trying to do the transboundary work.
So the issue that came up is obviously the role of Section 35 consultation in the negotiations and our work with the Aboriginal governments. Section 35 is most often, of course, it's an obligation, a duty to consult of government, and it's triggered in a situation where you may make a decision that might impact Aboriginal rights, and so the duty is to consult and where appropriate accommodate. In our view, this agreement adds a further layer of protection rather than being an infringement of rights. And so what we tried to do is work to build consent among all of our Aboriginal government partners. And so we do that through a couple of mechanisms, both technically through what we call the Aboriginal Steering Committee, which advises the Environment of Natural Resources on the water strategy. We've done it many times for the Wildlife Act. Here in the Northwest Territories was jointly drafted by all Aboriginal governments and their legal councils with the GNWT. And so the water agreement is really just a furtherance of that particular approach, where we believe achieving agreement together from the earliest stages and working it all the way through the negotiation process is the best approach. And so that's the one that we took. And it's a good news story because it builds on the strong relationships we have and are continuing to try to build with Aboriginal government partners in the north. The negotiating approach we have had many pieces, and you can see the bullets, I won't go over them, but are just our simple rules about how to try to succeed in the negotiations. But the most important thing in our view was that it was an interest-based process, and that means that all interests at the table, regardless who brings them, were valid interests and must be addressed. Doesn't matter who holds them, what the interests are, there's no value judgment on them. And so you couldn't come up with an option at the end of the day and put it in an agreement unless it met your interests. And so we didn't have to, nobody had to justify why they believed what they believed or whether it was a valuable interest to have. And that's a significant difference than most negotiations, and it's one that is really critical in this kind of a situation.
So I just want to point to 6 little boxes in terms of the practical realities for us of how we approach the negotiations we're doing with Transboundary and other areas. But it's for us, it's a critical approach given our size and some of the challenges we have about using all the levers. We have to be more nimble, more prepared. When you go there, you got to be prepared to spend money to keep the process going, try to drive every agenda, and something that in my 20 years as an MLA has become clear very quickly, that we always try to be the first ones to table documents to focus the discussion and allow things to move forward. So those are, I think, good approaches to live by when it comes to this business.
Okay, so the last few slides, we've only got 6 more slides. In the interest of time, we'll try to be brief. But why should this agreement matter to the rest of Canada?
It's simple for us. Merrell-Ann touched on it in the previous slide, but for us, in terms of getting along, we have a huge Aboriginal population here, biggest landowners other than the Crown, that when you collaborate, look towards prior and informed consent, get the Aboriginal governments at the table at the starting phase. Doesn't matter if it's drafting legislation like the Wildlife Act, doing a water strategy, or actually negotiating transboundary agreements. Get them at the table. They have a role to play, and it has allowed us to work through long outstanding issues, complex issues, and deal with ones like the transboundary that have been sitting there since 1997. And we think it's not rocket science, but we think that this process has value outside of the Northwest Territories. And the other thing I touched on earlier, but I just want to touch on it as well, what we've learned through this process is that you can compress time. If there's political attention and you squeeze the system, the bureaucratic system, that you can do things in sometimes months that would take years. We are currently, one of the files Merrell-Ann has now got put on as well, as we're negotiating a big federal park up here with the federal government that's been on the books since 1970, 45 years. We were given the file 6 months ago, and by using what we learned with transboundary negotiations on this Tyden Park, we compressed at least 4 years of work into 6 months, where we took a proposed park to a footprint that has a federal park surrounded by a territorial park, where the lines were agreed to by the federal government, territorial government, and the Aboriginal governments in the region. And it's all because we took that approach to get it done. And so it works in many arenas.
So the other piece is the agreement and the process to reach it, the collaborative process to reach it, is actually an example in our view of basin-level nested governance. And I'll explain what we mean by that. So if you see, for example, this drawing of a basin with a divide, and you add, for example, political jurisdictional boundaries over it as those black lines, you can see that here, the yellow dotted line is really, that's the Mackenzie River Basin Master Agreement, right? It's meant to look at how all of the jurisdictions within the dotted yellow line collaborate together, and they do so through the terms of that agreement and through the Mackenzie River Basin Board, which is created by that agreement. What you also have, though, is at each line, each of those black dotted lines, you have a bilateral agreement that governs the waters just crossing those borders. And so you can see you have a nested agreement there. And what happens under our Transboundary Agreement is the creation of another committee called the Bilateral Management Committee. And what we're trying to do is have the Bilateral Management Committees communicate with the Mackenzie River Basin Board. Now, the GNWT, say within our borders, of course, we manage waters, and we have a couple of ways that when we come to the table, the Bilateral Management Committee table, how do we bring the governance of water within our jurisdiction to that table? Well, first we have our Devolution Agreement, which gave us admin and control of land and waters, and Aboriginal governments that are signatory to that agreement form part of what's called the Intergovernmental Council, which is the council of GNWT, the GNWT Council, cabinet and the Aboriginal leaders from the governments, and they meet together to discuss how lands and waters are going to be managed in the NWT. And so their views feed into the GNWT as the GNWT brings those views to the Bilateral Management Committee. Similarly, within the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, who is charged with implementing the water strategy, we have Aboriginal government representatives that bring technical knowledge and traditional knowledge to the water strategy interpretation, and that information is then fed through the GNWT and onto the Bilateral Management Committee. And the Bilateral Management Committee will also have its own representative, Aboriginal government representative, chosen by the Aboriginal Steering Committee, our Aboriginal Steering Committee. So you can see we have, I think this is a good example of how systems nest, and the idea of just how we employed all of these pieces in order to negotiate is also the process of governance in action.
I just want to quickly restate the water energy connection and the fact that working with Alberta, that together we reached an agreement that has dealt with very complex issues with two political jurisdictions that have two different distinct political regimes, yet we managed, working as we did, interest-based negotiations, but with staying at the table in a compressed time frame to come up with an agreement that shows that there is a link in my mind to the water energy in Canada, not only in the Mackenzie River Basin, but it's an approach that needs to be looked at, should be looked at. I've brought it up at every federal, provincial environment ministers table that I go to, and I've brought it up with the Premier to raise at Council of the Federation. But there is a value, there is a connection, and we've shown that you can do it no matter who it is if you have the right process and framework and people at the table.
So the sound of one hand clapping is quiet, nothing happens, it doesn't work. And this is what the image we had in our mind. If you think about science without a firm policy base or a direction, if you have policy in place, water policy, but you don't have effective laws, if you have laws that you are implementing but they don't have the relationships behind them to support them, if you have relationships but you don't grant the time and bring them in at all times, if you have time but without specific goals, so if you think long-term but without immediate time pressure, also pushing the conception of time, and then if you have these goals, more immediate goals, but they again don't have foundations, you really don't have a situation that works. And we think that all of these pieces, and it's about the complexity of water negotiations, is that our experience is that we had to have basically all of these pieces in place. Good science, policy foundation, legal tools like the land claims, relationships like with Aboriginal governments and with our political apparatus, but all kinds of time pressure, long-term view, short-term view, and then we had to have very clear goals about what we were trying to accomplish. I think it can happen, and our negotiation with Alberta and upcoming completion of agreement with BC and others, I think shows that it can happen. People just need to embrace that complexity. And the final slide, the final takeaway is just that particularly half of the population in Northwest Territories is Aboriginal. The idea of reconciliation is one that the Supreme Court on Aboriginal Rights Law has mentioned many, many, many times, as has the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I do think that it applies to all Canadians, not just Aboriginal Canadians. And negotiations like this and agreements like this, I think, help us get there, particularly if Aboriginal governments are heavily involved. But it's other forms of reconciliation, I think, that come into play here. This is an ecosystem agreement, so it's about ecosystem and humans, not just humans, big guy, little guy, upstream, downstream, Aboriginal and non, and present into the future. If we're talking about maintaining ecological integrity, that's a long-term future-oriented goal. And it does create a social contract. We have worked to strengthen our relationship with Alberta, and we will continue to do that, as well with the public and others. So I think it achieves it as a reconciliation process and can be used and viewed in that way.
As we wrap up, I just wanted to update folks here that things haven't stopped since March 18th. That, as Merrell-Ann indicated, we're going to have a final call, we believe, with British Columbia today, and I'm very hopeful that we will have an actual signed agreement sometime within the next 68 days, which will be a major accomplishment. At the same time, as we look at the final days of our government and looking to the next government, we have in Environment Natural Resources, once again using the considerable skill of Merrell-Ann, we've been doing legislative proposals to rewrite and modernize the Water Act, the Territorial Parks Act, the Environmental Rights Act, the Environmental Protection Act, and the Forest Management Act. All major pieces of legislation, critical pieces, and the next government will be the first government post-devolution, and it's going to be up to that government to start setting the legal foundation that will help lock in and guide a lot of the policy work we've done to date with the strategic plan for water, as well as the transboundary negotiations and those type of things will then be covered off by what we want to be some of the best legislation, environmental legislation in the country. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you. That was fantastic. Thanks, Minister Merrell-Ann, for sharing your story. I think we'll move on to our question period now. So I invite all of you that are participating to type your questions into the chat box for the Minister or Merrell-Ann. And I'll also bring up some resources that you might find of interest. So the first link there is for the 2015 Northwest Territories Alberta Bilateral Water Management Agreement. The second one is for the original 1997 Mackenzie River Basin Master Agreement. And then the third one is the 2010 Northern Voices Northern Waters Water Strategy. So if you're wanting to examine the provisions of these agreements more in depth, you could probably find those of interest. Okay, and we did have an earlier question that I think we can start with. So it's from Cecilia Wong, and she's asking, will the water quality objectives or standards be legally enforceable, or are they simply reference levels?
Okay, so this agreement is not a contract. It is a cooperative agreement. That said, when we signed it, the Premier at the time of Alberta said, this is a legally binding agreement. We believe it is also. However, it's the nature of setting water quality, their water quality objectives. So our intention is to clearly not go over those objectives. And there's a process set out in Section 4 of the agreement that says what happens if you do go over any objective that you set, because there can be water quality, water quantity, groundwater, or biological objectives that are set depending on the classification of the river. And so there's a process that's set out, and it includes immediately coming back underneath the objective, doing what you need to do to make that happen, etc. And if it's not possible, then a number of things can be discussed, conciliative measures, other approaches to address the problem. At the end of the day, though, this agreement does not create a new cause of action. It doesn't create a new thing that you can sue or a new regulatory regime saying this is the rule and if you violate it, you'll get this penalty. That's not what this is about. It's a cooperative agreement in that sense, but it goes, I think, as far as you can go in a cooperative agreement to trying to achieve very tight commitments.
Great, thanks, Merrell-Ann. So we have another question from Rosie Sims, who is hosting our live viewing at the University of Victoria. She's asking, did the federal government have a specific role in the negotiation?
They had a role initially as we were still negotiating our own devolution agreement, so they wanted to be part of the negotiations. Part of the intense debate was they wanted to have 2 points of the spear, and it didn't work. I mean, there's no way we could move like that. So they became part of the team for the process till we signed devolution, and then they removed themselves. But it was one that issue of considerable friction at the time.
So, for example, I was the chief negotiator, and I had a lead negotiator from the government of the Northwest Territories and a lead negotiator from the federal government. And the three of us worked together to resolve issues before we went into the negotiations with Alberta. So before each meeting, we would work out if we had any differences of view, which we sometimes did, and then we agreed that I would be the one that would speak in the meetings as the chief negotiator on behalf of what was then the two governments.
Great, thank you. So another question from KT Shum asking, how is climate change factored into natural variability?
Okay, so we had a choice as a negotiating team whether we were going to have kind of a climate change section in the agreement or whether we were going to try to have climate change kind of factored in throughout the agreement. And we chose the latter approach because we didn't actually think you could have a section dealing with all of the things that climate change dealt with, because what it really does is climate change means that we have to be more proactive, more cautious, longer term thinking, look at the science and more sort of proactive in terms of our science generation and things like that. And so you could see in each of the many of the sections of the agreement, you'll see specific reference to climate change information or the potential for studies related to climate change. In the appendices where we get into much more detail about the specific sections, you'll see climate change referred to there a lot. And what we did also was just push for very cautious approaches to how much water could be taken, knowing, for example, that we don't know into the future whether water levels are going to decrease or increase. We have some science on that, but we don't know for sure. And so that was in general, and I think we were all on the same page on that. That obviously we were, that's how we got to the agreement. But yeah, it was to look at all of the ways that climate change would need to be factored into our decision-making now and in the future. And that's also a key reason why the agreement is considered an adaptive agreement, where we're continually meeting with Alberta through our bilateral management committee to review the science, review all of the monitoring, because the agreement contains an extensive section and appendix on monitoring, which I urge you to look at. It's really an excellent situation, and we have to continue to look at that and what it means and whether it's telling us things about climate that impacts that need to be addressed in, for example, how we set water quality objectives or water quantity objectives, et cetera.
Okay, thanks, Merrell-Ann. So another question, this one's from Lois Little, and I presume she's referring to the 2015 agreement. She's asking, are there any provisions to exempt water governance from trade or investor-state agreements?
No, there aren't.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question from Scott Bates. He says, I can't help but see the linkages with the Great Lakes Charter and various agreements. And he's asking, did you draw on any lessons learned or people involved in these negotiations? So in the Great Lakes Charter negotiations?
So we had some of the best people in the country, and Merrell-Ann will give you their names, but we had folks that were involved in the Great Lakes from Ontario that are still involved, that were actually key parts of our negotiating team. But I'll let Merrell-Ann touch quickly on some of the folks. Plus we had to set up a group of advisors as well from different universities and water organizations that were very, very helpful.
Well, and one of our team was a gentleman named Ralph Pentland, who was with Environment Canada for many years and was one of the people responsible for all of their the water agreements, transboundary water agreements and others from kind of the last generation. And he's extremely involved in the Great Lakes and the International Joint Commission. And so he was a huge source of information, as were expert advisors like David Schindler and Rob DeLoe and Jim Bruce and Nigel Banks and different people who both looked at that agreement from the legal side and from the water side, and in particular that agreement and the approach they took in, which changed partway through our negotiations, about how to deal with the toxic bioaccumulative persistent chemicals, and the list that they used and how they approached it did influence us, yes.
Great, thank you. So a comment and a question from Shirley Thompson. So she found the presentation very hopeful and transformative, and she says she'll definitely be doing the readings. And she's asking if we're going to have the slides available as well. So Minister Merrell-Ann, if you're comfortable, I can PDF the slides and circulate them to participants. That's something you'd like to consider?
Yep, that's fine.
Great. Okay, so we'll let Shirley know that. And we have a question from David Brooks. He says, I attended with both of you a large meeting that was informally called the Funeral of Environment Canada. At that time, there was little hope of bringing Alberta into the agreement, and he's asking what has happened to change Alberta's approach.
I think it was the political connection that we had with the various premiers and with the Alberta government, and the fact that for them as well, it was a piece of unfinished business, an agreement signed in 1997. And I have a file that is very thick in my 9 years. I'm one of the longest serving, or the longest serving environment minister in the country, and I've been on this file now and pushing all the jurisdictions for some considerable time, and I've lost track of the number of federal ministers I've dealt with as well. So it has been, I think, the unrelenting political pressure from us, and we're getting it from all our constituents about the need to deal with this, and Alberta as well, realizing that this was something that in the long run would benefit them, and thus we got it done.
I also think that depending on when you might have talked to any member of the negotiating team, so about a year ago, that would have been maybe around the time that we switched tracks and agreed as all jurisdictions that we would suspend discussions with Alberta for a little while to try to work out issues with BC, because having a conversation with Alberta about their concerns about whether the provision would make sense for them in a BC agreement wasn't effective. We needed to either get together as three jurisdictions together, or we needed to just deal with the most upstream jurisdiction. And so it was probably around that time that we were struggling with how to deal with this meat and the sandwich issue, and we found a way through it, obviously. I think all jurisdictions were very committed to getting the agreement done, but as I said, all agreements done. But as I said, it's very complex, right? Like the level of complexity and all the moving parts just became almost overwhelming at some times, and that might have been at one of those moments about a year ago.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Margot Late, and I think we have a couple questions after that, and then we'll wrap up shortly after. And Margot is asking, what models were employed to develop the systems approach to negotiations? Okay, so I wasn't the one who thought this up, obviously. It predated my time, a stroke of brilliance by whoever did. I think I would have to say, you know, the jurisdictions, I think the Mackenzie River Basin Board had a role in determining the approach to negotiations. I also think each of the jurisdictions fed in. And then the role of Compass, which is a facilitation organization which has an approach called structured decision making. They also bring a lot of experience in systems kind of based negotiations. And as a chief negotiator, and the minister, we just kind of think that way also. You can't be involved in this level of negotiation, I think, without being aware of all of the various pieces at play and trying to find a way to sort through it. And thankfully, we had a really great facilitator through Compass and Lee Failing that was able to do that really effectively. But it kind of comes with the territory. And I think the Northwest Territories also has extensive experience in all styles of negotiation through their land claims. They've been on this path for a long time, figuring out how to work through these complicated systems. Great, thank you, Merrell-Ann. We have a question again from Lois Little asking, are there significant differences between the Northwest Territories and Alberta agreements versus the Northwest Territories and BC agreements?
I would say, as a yes/no answer, no. I think there's different wording that different systems who have different political drivers or different legal counsel are more comfortable with one set of words rather than the other. In our assessment, we are willing and supportive of both agreements because in our view both meet our interests. There's just slightly different ways. I'd have to say probably 95% of the agreement is absolutely identical. And all agreements have one section that is unique to that agreement, because almost every agreement has one major water body that it wanted to identify specific provisions for. So for example, the BC-Alberta agreement has a section dealing with the Peace, and we have one with Alberta dealing with the Slave, and I think Alberta with Saskatchewan will have one dealing with the Athabasca, etc. And so that would, but it's still, even those sections are in line with all of the other provisions, they're just dealing with what's the specific arrangement that will be made now on that particular river.
Great, thanks Merrell-Ann, and I think we'll make this our last question. It's from Rosie Sims, so it's someone that's at our live viewing at the University of Victoria, asking a question about interbasin transfers and asking what situation would arise that a special act would allow for an IBT, and what water needs would drive such a transfer.
So I think we see this situation as being highly unlikely, and probably at the end of the day, we wanted a full prohibition on interbasin transfer, but what allowed us to agree with this at the end of the day is we figured if we're talking about transferring big amounts of water out of the Mackenzie, there's probably a really serious situation that is, you know, humanitarian, in need, that kind of thing, that we would probably be dealing with in other political fora anyway. But generally, I urge you to look at Alberta's legislation. They have, that's their structure, where they don't allow interbasin transfer without a license granted by special act of legislature. So they have, in our view, the things that would be valid would be fire suppression, humanitarian needs, things like that. Alberta may have a different view, and if we ever get there, we may have that tough discussion. But at this point, I think we're both on the same page that for the very long into the future, it won't be something that we will have to deal with or hope to deal with.
Great, thanks very much, Merrell-Ann. So I think we will conclude our question period now, and I'll move on to my wrap-up. So I want to thank Minister Miltenberger and Merrell-Ann for their expertise shared through their presentations and in our question period today. And thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar. We record all of our webinars and house them on our YouTube channel, and the link is right there on the slide for our YouTube channel. You can view all of our archived webinars there, and I'll be circulating the link to this webinar once it's posted online, which will most likely be in the next 2 weeks. And as some of you may be aware, we typically do 5 webinars in each Creating a Blue Dialogue season. And as I mentioned in my introduction, this is the first webinar in our 6th season, and our next session will explore the need for legal protection of environmental flows, and will take place in late October. And we'll be finalizing the details of that session shortly, so just stay tuned for when we circulate the invitation for that session. And for those of you that don't get our webinar invitations and would like to receive them in the future, just send me a note. My email is ra@polisproject.org, and I can add you to our mailing list. And so with that, I think that's it from us. Take care, everyone, and you'll hear from myself and the WSP team with follow-up resources and discussion in the next few weeks. So thank you.